I'd like to start by considering the feminine, because after many years of oppression, it has become very elusive, and it takes time to really connect with her great depth and her great energy. But if we remove her veils of mystery, we come to recognize that she's very relevant to all of us, because the feminine is an element and pattern we all carry within ourselves, whether we're men or women. And we also come to recognize that she's very relevant to everything around us, because the feminine is the one half of the divine androgen, which is the deepest archetype that flows through creation. In talking about the feminine, I'm talking about the archetypal feminine, because it has a stronger force and charge than the personal feminine. The personal feminine, very diagrammatically, is something like your own mother, and the archetypal feminine is the Great Mother, or Virgin Mary, or the Great Goddess. Now, as an archetype, the feminine is always and ever present. She pushes through the collective layers of the unconscious, where the archetypes reside, and she speaks to us in many voices. She speaks to us individually, and she speaks to us collectively. But while she's never absent, she very often goes by unnoticed. Because today we've forgotten who the goddess is and how to recognize her daily whispers. We have reduced her great depth and power to a very flat version of womanhood. Gareth Hill is a Jungian analyst that has done a lot of work around gender, and he's divided the feminine in two aspects, her static aspect and her dynamic aspect. And in doing so, he's managed to map out the most essential qualities and the great depth of the feminine essence. The static feminine is linked to motherhood and nourishment. She carries within her body primal secrets of creation. She's able to conceive the potential for life and give birth to it. And in doing so, she participates in the greatest mystery of life on earth. That great mystery is the ability to manifest the soul into material life. But we've forgotten how great that mystery is today, and we've reduced it to a very dry series of medical terms. But in that mystery, the feminine is the embodiment of creation and regeneration. It is that link the feminine has with regeneration that makes her essential for our individual and our collective healing processes. Woman magic and earth magic are linked. They both create and they both nourish life. And for our early ancestors, that link was at first a great point of worship, until man gradually tried to control, manipulate, and suppress both. And he created a very deep imbalance in his relationship with both. The dynamic feminine is very different. The dynamic feminine free flows, and she forms according to what fate brings her way. She engages with direct experience, and she reaches through to knowledge that belongs to the deep inner worlds. She is yielding, responsive, receptive, and intuitive. We feel her energy when we see children playing, because she represents that authentic, spontaneous way of being. And we also feel her energy behind the chaos of the forest floor, because she has a creative link with the regenerative aspects of chaos. She's also the force behind all evolution, because she's part of that creative synthesis where new possibilities emerge out of. Now, the spaces the dynamic feminine represents can be fascinating and ecstatic, but they can also be disorienting and very frightening. And these are spaces that, as a society, we've tried to avoid, resist, and ignore. But this has left the goddess without priestesses in our society. And in the absence of her guides, she meets us in the lands of the unconscious and the altered states of consciousness. Through dreams, active imagination, meditation, holotropic breathwork, entheogenic journeys, she can transfer her energies to us. Her transformative energies link our matter to our soul and support the expansion of our consciousness. So the unconscious is where the feminine work goes on undisturbed. But again, her guidance remains hidden in the darkness, because in our Western society, we don't know how to decipher the archaic symbolic speech of dreams and imaginations that uses to get through to us. In our culture, we recognize language, which is a masculine principle. Language is the rational and ordered container of experience. The lands beyond that space belong to the feminine. And there we can meet that which is beyond words or beyond immediate perception. Now the myths and the language we've held the feminine in have drained her enormous strength and energy and have driven her energies underground. We have called the feminine irrational, emotional, hysterical, chaotic, subjective, and by holding the feminine in these words, we've linked her with energies that our societies have always feared and tried to control. But the word feminine stands for the soul. It's a reference for our interconnectedness, our place within a sacred order. The archetypal feminine gives us a link to ourselves, she gives us the link to life, and she gives us the link to the divine. In terms of mythology, I'll use a very classic one. In the Garden of Eden, Eve took a bite from the apple, from the sacred tree of knowledge. What followed was the primordial drag-past. This was a mythos that suppressed the feminine and expanded awareness into sin within our consciousness and merged them with the shadow side. This was the point humanity fell into duality. Up until that point, the bad was somewhere out there. It was carried by a snake. But from that point onwards, humanity got wrapped in it. The paradox had no solution. We were either in the garden or out of it. Mythologically speaking, this was the point our species developed ego consciousness. To stay in the garden was to remain in the unconscious Eden. To leave the garden was to become aware, and that is self-aware. We have since kept femtheogenic consciousness in exile. We have systematically maintained its inferiority, and we've remained very suspicious of its depth and potential. The feminine and entheogens have been suppressed because their force and energy could not be assimilated by our species. We've reduced both to a diabolical form, and we've seen them as very dangerous and very seductive forces. Now, my presentation is arguing that the feminine is very psychedelic. She shares entheogenic qualities that can heal, transform, and support the expansion of our consciousness. These qualities are also shared points of suppression because these are qualities that go against the grain of our Western mindset. So I'm going to go through a series of these. One of the major insights femtheogenic consciousness opens us up to is the awareness of connectedness and oneness. We have been caught in the illusion of separateness for centuries, and that illusion has alienated us from Earth, ourselves, and each other. In our state of separateness, we have disconnected spirit from nature and creation from creator. We think that nature is something out there. We've forgotten that nature is what we're made of. And we no longer see the world as sacred. We see the world as a series of hierarchical relations with our species very conveniently located in the dominator's position. And from that narcissistic bubble, all we can recognize in the mirrors of the world around us is ourselves and our own needs. We have somehow believed that our needs entitle us to control, manipulate all natural resources, and we've created a crisis that's environmental, it's social, and it's ultimately spiritual. But the femtheogenic consciousness tells us very clearly we are one. That oneness is a spiritual connection. It speaks about the reflections we emit to each other, because we're all mirrors of our shared humanity. We all hold each other within ourselves. But that oneness is not just a metaphysical idea. It's what chaos theorists have called the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings on one continent and weeks later creates a hurricane in another continent. It's the oneness we witness in the effects of deforestation, industrialization, the effects the consuming greed of the West has on the East. It's a very real and direct experience of the world around us. But the feminine consciousness is by nature aware that everything is connected. This is a knowledge the feminine has always carried within her body, within her sacred centers of creation, where all life has emerged and regenerated from. And it's the same with entheogenic spaces. They have an inherent understanding of that oneness. In these spaces, we're being shown all the threads that connect us to each other and to the wider cosmos. That invisible space of connectedness, that space of singularity, that femtheogenic consciousness opens us up to, at its core, has eros. And to recognize this is to awaken to one of the most powerful forces in the universe. The next femtheogenic link relates to boundary-dissolving experiences. Now, as I've already said, our societies are based on divisive boundaries that maintain the illusion of separateness. And the ultimate and most dreaded boundary to cross is the dissolution of the ego. The ego has been a big part of our evolution, and as a concept in itself, it can have many useful functions. What is dysfunctional is our need to hold on to it. Because the ego needs to undergo many deaths if we are to unfold into a more authentic version of who we are. We need to peel through the layers to get through to the core of who we really are. Motherhood is a fundamental experience of boundary dissolution, where the other is contained within oneself. And that's not just a physical symbiotic bond, that's a symbiotic bond that extends way beyond the birthing process. Entheogenic spaces, entheogenic experiences, by their very nature, are based on the dissolution of boundaries on various levels. In these spaces, the divisive lines between us and other, conscious and unconscious, past, present and future, masculine and feminine, they all dissolve. And that's the most threatening aspect of entheogenic journeys for individuals and for the general status quo. But that's where femtheogenic consciousness delivers us to. It's a point where in order to evolve and transform, we need to transcend our own boundaries and in the process be released from our false selves and our false values. The next femtheogenic link relates to chaos. Now, we've tried to tame chaos for centuries because we believed it to be one of our greatest survival threats. It's not always been like that. The early alchemists and the early Gnostics recognized chaos as a vital element in the creative process of transformation. Today, though, we relate to chaos as a stage of disintegration rather than a state of transformation. And we've not been able to link into its transformative aspects. Now, as I've already said, our early ancestors linked nature with the feminine. And as they gradually experienced nature as a chaotic force that needed to be controlled and mastered, they transferred that onto the feminine. And that's how our unconscious link between the feminine and chaos got installed. But as I've already said, in the form of the dynamic feminine, the feminine has her own creative link with chaos, and that's with the regenerative, true aspects of chaos. Entheogenic journeys embrace chaos, and they teach us that it can be a very valid stage in our unfolding process of becoming. During a deep entheogenic journey, we're taken apart and we're then put together. Chaos gives birth to new order that's of greater complexity than before, and that's hopefully a step further in our evolutionary journey. Now, a big part of what has driven our connection with nature, the feminine, and entheogens underground is our collective difficulty to be with chaos. And femtheogenic consciousness has the capacity to revive that relationship in a very meaningful way. The next femtheogenic link relates to the vital cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And I'm going to ask for a cup of water, please. Thank you. For our early ancestors, the feminine powers of fertility and birth were a conscious symbol of the cycles they witnessed in nature, the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And our ancestors learned from nature that death is not an end in itself. Death is a stage of regeneration. But today we've lost that wisdom, and we deal with death with dread. We're unable, we don't have the tools to relate to its deeper essence, and we're involved in a collective denial of death. But the goddess that gives life is the goddess that takes life. Creation gives place to destruction. Destruction that's in service to life, because that thing exists, gives place to creation. The archetypal feminine goddess Kali is a powerful symbol of that wisdom. Kali is a goddess that's in, constant movement. Kali is in constant movement. She creates to destroy, she destroys to create, and she's indifferent to our ego's demands for survival. For her, all experience is one, life or death. We can only recover our deep inner treasures by facing the dark side of the goddess, the dark side of the archetypal feminine, the devourer and the transformer. And it's the same with entheogenic journeys. The most significant journeys that people report, the most profound, the most significant, the most long-lasting experiences out of, are the ones that unfold within a supportive set and setting and lead us to the ultimate spiritual experience of ego death. Femtheogenic consciousness allows us to flee our ego, if only for a second, and receive the wisdom that necessitates and even welcomes death. Now, that's not to say that death, loss, change are not very painful transition portals, because they really are. That's to also access the wider understanding that tells us it is our ego that grieves. On a soul level, things are very different, because our souls know that every end is a drop in a very vast ocean. The next femtheogenic link relates to time. Now, time has been a major symbol in our societies, and we've learned to treat it as a very fixed and static construct. But the feminine rhythms of regeneration reveal timelessness. The goddess of birth and death contains a soul that has moved through various birth canals. She participates in a mystery that intersects time. It goes beyond time. And it's the same with entheogenic spaces. They reveal the same timelessness. In these journeys, we're being shown experiences that defy our logic. And we're allowed to journey through past, present, and future in the most extraordinary ways. So femtheogenic consciousness allows us to witness and experience a very different sense of time. The next femtheogenic link relates to creativity. Now, patriarchy has suppressed our creative forces by focusing on the mind and the logic. But femtheogenic consciousness supports the creative dimension of our evolution. The goddess is the creative matrix of life for our species. It's where all life has emerged and regenerated from, for our species. And that forges her primal link with creativity. She is connected to the patterns that belong to creation. Entheogenic spaces are highly creative spaces. They speak to us through images, symbols, and feeling states that are carried forward by visions. Now, these visions create metaphors that allow us to connect to that which is beyond words or beyond immediate perception. But our societies have not acknowledged the creative and ultimately healing potential of these states, and we've only learned to see them as chaotic, dangerous, and very destructive states. Now, I've mentioned femtheogenic wisdom a lot, and I'm referring to a particular kind of knowing that our societies have long neglected and ignored. Femtheogenic knowing is intuitive, it's non-linear, and it's informed by the creative source. Femtheogenic knowing reaches through to the invisible, and that includes the invisible corners of our psyche. That is where our shadow lives. To claim our shadow and our darkness helps us cultivate compassion for ourselves and in reflection for others. This is where we come to see the limitations of our human nature and where the heart can work on forgiveness. This work is essential if we are to heal our psychic splits and their outward expressions. Now, femtheogenic consciousness allows us to live in more authentic, instinctual, and spontaneous ways of living. In trying to shield ourselves from our impermanence and our lack of control, we've learned to perceive reality in the world as very concrete. Now, that concreteness has offered us some safety, but it can also lead to staticness, staleness, and ultimately deadness, which is ironically the very thing our egos are trying to avoid in the first place. We operate from a state of doing, unable to tolerate a state of being and not being taught how to do that. But the feminine consciousness is not bounded by rules or orders. She exists in an absolute freedom that is full of potential. And it's the same with entheogens. By dissolving our egos and making us die and rebirth infinite times within the space of a few hours, they shake away our social masks and they help us question the unquestionable. So who we can become under the guidance of entheogenic consciousness can be far wider and broader than what the stagnant social matrix allows us to ever imagine. The final entheogenic link relates to the unconscious. Now, for Jungian analysts, consciousness has always been associated with the masculine, and the unconscious has always been the terrain of the feminine. And as we've seen in the beginning of the presentation, it's the dynamic feminine that holds a connection to this innate, symbolic, psychic landscapes we all contain within ourselves. And she communicates these spaces to us through imagination and altered states of consciousness. Now, entheogenic spaces, entheogenic experiences also bring unconscious material into consciousness, and they allow us a glimpse of our undercurrent realms. Femtheogenic consciousness creates, and I want to emphasize that, the potential. And the potential means nothing until it's realized. But they create the potential for our conscious and unconscious selves to meet and integrate. And that can pave the way for our psychological journey towards wholeness. Now, I believe that femtheogenic consciousness has the capacity to support our collective healing processes. But for that to happen, we need to resurrect the true and deeper essence from our unconscious, because patriarchy has suppressed both the feminine and entheogens into our collective shadow. Patriarchy is a paranoid state of consciousness that tries to suppress anything that holds any potential for power and anything that threatens its structures. And it has actively waged the war against the feminine and entheogens. Patriarchy has dissected the feminine, and it has thrown her essential elements away, and in the process it has wounded both men and women. In that disconnection, we've lost our knowledge of her ancient mystery traditions, and we've denied her wisdom in the rational and scientific world we have created and surrounded ourselves with. Entheogens also pose a problem for patriarchy because entheogenic experiences make the maintenance of rigid hierarchies unsustainable, and that's a major threat for patriarchy. Patriarchy has responded to that threat by making us believe that the use of entheogens is an immoral and antisocial threat to our society. And it has validated the criminal persecution of cognitive liberty, which is the freedom to alter or affect one's consciousness. The masculine and the feminine are the fundamental archetypal energies of life, and they make up the entire universe. We're being called to create new mythologies that integrate the solar masculine consciousness with the lunar feminine wisdom. A healthy future needs to be balanced by the divine androgen. Evolution for our species at this point is a matter of interiority. We need to go within and discover who we really are, away from our social personas and the social constructs that keep us fragmented within ourselves. This is not about having insight. Change means change. We need to die to our jobs, we need to die to our faiths, we need to die to our friendships, we need to die to aspects of our own selves, and everything that no longer supports the true freedom of who we really are. Every one of these deaths is a sacred initiation for the emergence of our true self. Women, entheogens, and nature will only be liberated after social revolution brings about structural change. There is revolt, sometimes expressed directly and sometimes indirectly, but nations around the world, including my own, are trying to shed away the expired political systems, the archaic socioeconomical complexes. We're one step away from assuming responsibility, and that's where our true freedom lies. But for all these energies to transform, we need the strong container of the goddess, and entheogens are a powerful channel of the feminine voice and essence. They return us to an embodied wisdom, and they have the capacity to transform our ego consciousness into a soul consciousness. They return us into alignment with our core, and they remind us of the sacred purpose of being alive. The revival of entheogenic consciousness can support the emergence of a planetary consciousness. Our crisis is a crisis of consciousness. We need to remember the world's wounds and imbalances are our own wounds and imbalances. First, we need to rescue our own souls. And in that way, we can participate in the mystery of